Okay, so let's look at some of these motor and sensory areas of our cerebrum. And when we do this, we're going to go into Handout 14C. And I need to spend some time with this, so let's get right to it. So here's Handout 14C, and the top of it is a picture of probably something you're familiar with in lab, the different lobes of our cerebrum. So in this case, this is the front, this is the back of the brain. And so this area is the frontal lobe, this is the temporal lobe, this is the occipital lobe, and then the parietal lobe is kind of the rainbow of colors with our precentral and postcentral gyrus. All right. Now, it says association areas within the cerebrum. We're going to talk about some of the major ones that I've picked out. And on the test, I'm not going to ask you where they're at. I'm going to ask you function questions, okay? So, of course, we just went over in the last video, we went over the precentral gyrus, and we went over the postcentral gyrus. So this first one, I kind of color-coded these. If you notice, they are color-coded. So it says postcentral gyrus is the somatosensory association area. So sensory, so body to brain. This somatosensory area is the postcentral gyrus, and this postcentral gyrus is going to be receiving information from our body regarding touch. So that's what we just covered in that last video. All right. Now, I think this is really interesting. We're just going to kind of move around this diagram. I'm going to keep inching it up and talking about each one kind of individually. So our occipital lobe is going to contain the visual association area. So all of your vision information as you watch this video, as you look outside, all of the information from your eyeballs are going to be interpreted and integrated into the back of your brain, into this occipital lobe. So it says the visual association area, we can recognize and evaluate sight. That is your occipital lobe. So we are interpreting sight, we're recognizing, we're processing that information, we're storing memories from sight in the occipital lobe. Pretty cool. All right. Another area, it says the auditory association area. The auditory association area is on the temporal lobe. And it's going to be doing the same thing, but for hearing. So we are going to be processing what we hear, integrating it into memories, forming memories, recalling memories in the auditory association area. So this area of our brain in the temporal lobe is going to be recognizing and evaluating sounds. That's how we can, you hear a sound and you're like, oh, I remember that person's voice. And then you associate that. Something that is related to this is this area called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is located in the parietal lobe, but I have it orange here. This area right here is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is going to be involved in understanding written and spoken language. So reading and hearing, so it's tied to the auditory association area, because you're going to be processing things that you are reading and things that you are hearing. So this area, Wernicke's area, is interpreting the sounds that you hear for speech. All right, spoken words and written words. Now, related to that is an area called Broca's area. Broca's area is located right here on our frontal lobe. So this is part of the frontal lobe. Broca's area is for speech. So it is going to be a motor area that allows you to form words and use speech. So, like right now, I'm using my Broca's area. My Broca's area is sending signals to my mouth, to my tongue, to my throat and vocal cords, so I can form the right words to say. I can think about what I want to say and then say that. So Broca's area involves processing what we want to say, deciding what that's going to be, and then producing the speech for that area. Really what's very interesting about these two areas is when we're kids, they're very plastic. So kids tend to be able to pick up speech and language pretty easily because this area is very dynamic in their brain. And unfortunately, as we get older, it becomes more fixed. So it's harder and harder for us to learn foreign languages the older we get, because this Wernicke's and Broca's area becomes more and more fixed and harder to adapt and learn. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in this chapter. So my brown area is called the premotor area, and it says it's right here. I'm starting to get above my diagram here as I slide up, but this is also part of the parietal lobe. And the premotor area, it says learned skilled movements. It's what we often call muscle memory. So like typing or riding a bicycle, you are processing that information and it's stored in this premotor area of your parietal lobe. And that allows you to process information and do repetitive things. So, it's like you never forget how to ride a bike. Well, that's because that information on how to ride a bike is stored in your premotor area of the brain. Then we have another area called the frontal eye field. This is also located right in our parietal lobe. The frontal eye field is going to be involved in using your eyes to scan information very quickly. Like if I told you to open your textbook and find, the word homeostasis, you can use your frontal eye field to quickly scan through a page or through the index until you find that word you're looking for. That is accomplished by this frontal eye field. And then finally, just for fun, I have listed here that the frontal lobe itself, our entire frontal lobe, is the part of the brain that gives us our personality. It turns out that most of the brain for every individual is pretty much the same. Your occipital lobe, your temporal lobes, they all pretty much are the same from individual to individual. What makes us unique and what makes us different is our frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is our personality. So if you are, very introverted, or you are an extrovert, or you're a type A personality, type B personality, that is all dictated by your frontal lobe. And your frontal lobe is what's going to be controlling those personality traits. For a long time, people thought that disorders like schizophrenia were caused by a imbalance in the frontal lobe. So they would give people, for example, like frontal lobotomies. They would actually go in and remove a chunk of the frontal lobe because they knew that the frontal lobe was involved in personalities, and they were trying to, quote, cure that person who had something like schizophrenia. Turns out that schizophrenia actually has nothing to do with personality. It has nothing to do with the frontal lobe. It is a miscommunication between the links of the brain between the diencephalon and the cerebrum and the frontal lobe, this area called the limbic system that we'll talk about soon. that actually is malfunctioning, and it has nothing to do with the frontal lobe. So giving someone a frontal lobotomy would actually do a lot more harm than good to those people. It would definitely change their personality, because if you scramble up that frontal lobe, it messes up their personality, but it didn't cure their schizophrenia, because schizophrenia doesn't involve that part of the brain. So kind of interesting. I don't know. I think that understanding, that different parts of the brain is pretty fascinating. Let's focus on the next video on this Wernicke's and Broca's area just for a short period of time. I want to mention that in a little more detail. And for this handout, just make sure that you know the major functions of each of these areas of the brain.